This is President Nayib Bukele's prison. It's the largest prison in Latin America, and it was built only a couple of years ago. Before he took office in 2019, El Salvador had the highest murder rate in the world. Now, it has the second lowest crime rate in the Western Hemisphere, right after Canada. Countless governments are shocked at this almost overnight change, and some say this came at a great cost.
Antes le teníamos a las pandillas, pero ahora le tememos a la autoridad y eso no tendría que ser. A la autoridad se le tiene que tener respeto, no miedo.
Others say Bukele's brutal crackdown was a long time coming.
Alguna gente dice que eso es un exceso. Yo lo que creo que era exceso era la cantidad de muertos. Para mí era un exceso la cantidad de niñas violadas en El Salvador todos los días. Para mí era un exceso todos los negocios que tenían que pagar extorsión.
Let's explore El Salvador's bloody war on gangs, its escalating violence, and its inevitable consequences. Before we can get to President Bukele and his brutal war on gangs, we must understand the beginnings of the unspeakable violence in El Salvador and its gangs.
But MS-13 is particularly violent. They don't like shooting people because it's too quick, it's too fast.
In February of 1980, Oscar Romero was the Archbishop of El Salvador. As El Salvador is a Catholic country, the Archbishop held considerable power and authority, but no one seemed to care about his advice anymore. And when he asked the US government to stop funding the very people who were running the country, he was ignored. Romero wrote an open letter to President Jimmy Carter, urging him to stop giving military aid to the El Salvadoran regime. This army was taking over El Salvador with the very military equipment he was sending. They were oppressing people, taking countless innocent lives, and taking over the government with threats and blood. Romero begged the US, the only way to obtain peace again was to stop their support. Jimmy Carter did not stop the aid, and 3 weeks later, Oscar Romero was assassinated. On March 31st that year, 250,000 people turned up at Oscar Romero's funeral. What did the Salvadoran National Guard do? They fired at the crowd, taking 42 lives and injuring over 200, as if Romero's supporters were the threat. And in December of that year, 4 American missionaries were snatched in broad daylight by the National Guard. They were subjected to fates worse than death by these monstrous men. Their deaths came as mercy. Their destroyed bodies were left out in the open for the public to see El Salvador's message to the Americans, who, by the way, were still funding their military. After this, Jimmy Carter finally ended the military aid. So in 1981, a civilian resistance force was formed, the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, or the FMLN, was a paramilitary group. And to fight the oppressive army, they ended up just as violent. They almost took over the country when Ronald Reagan was elected in the US. And you all know how Reagan wanted to fight the communist threat by funding far-right military groups in Latin and South America. Yeah, politics are brutal, and they cost innocent lives. Reagan not only restarted the financial aid to the Salvadoran National Guard, but increased it to $10 million. $5 million went to rifles, ammo, grenades, and helicopters. Throughout the 1980s, El Salvador was ravaged by a war of indescribable violence and brutality. People lay dead in the streets in piles. They were dying too fast to be buried properly, and women were subjected to tragic things by violent men with a penchant for cruelty and control. In 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed. This meant an end to the foreign financial support to the FMLN, but it also meant Reagan had no reason to use the communist threat as an excuse to fund armies anymore. You might say, phew, the war could finally be over, right? Well, there was a problem. Although the war was officially over, thousands of Salvadorians had fled to the US, and the young men and boys, traumatized by the war and feeling alien in LA, started El Salvador's bloodiest gangs to date, MS-13 and Barrio 18. It was in Los Angeles that El Salvador immigrants met other immigrants from Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico. Soon, they formed the Mara Salvatrucha. Mara is slang for gang. Salva stands for El Salvador, and Trucha means street smart. What about the 13? That's just the position of the letter M in the alphabet. But the MS-13 was never a peaceful community of Hispanic immigrants, watching each other's backs. They soon got a reputation for extreme brutality and machete slayings. According to the FBI, the MS-13 gang has now spread to 46 states. In 2012, the U.S. Treasury designated the gang a transnational criminal organization. It was the first street gang to receive the dubious honor, placing it alongside much larger international cartels like the Mexican Zetas, Japanese Yakuza, and Italian Camorra. It started out as a gang of unruly teens who lacked the care, support, and healthy childhood others had. Then, it became a group of monsters. And to this day, they stay brutal by recruiting poor, vulnerable teens from backgrounds of petty crime or narcotics addiction. It's heartbreaking to think so many teens end up in places like MS-13 instead of getting the help and support they need to overcome their rough upbringing. As a result of this, Ronald Reagan devised stricter laws against immigration, and in 1996, a new law ensured that criminal Latin Americans would be deported back to their home countries. And that's how the Salvador gangs reached El Salvador. The problem was that now, these gangs were in control. Not the National Guard, not the government. And they weren't just unaliving each other in broad daylight. They also preyed on women and children. As late as 2015, El Salvador had the highest femicide rate in the world. 1 in 5,000 women would lose her life, and countless others fell victim to horrific SA. And imagine how lax the law was around this when the gangs were in control. Very few cases would be reported too, as the poor women feared more retaliation from the gangs. Around the same time, El Salvador was the murder capital of the world, with a rate 20 times higher than the US. It topped any list of dangerous countries and crime, and every other government advised against visiting it. There was no justice and no sense of safety in El Salvador, and gang members knew they would either end up dead themselves or in prison, together with their fellow gang members.
We're at the Central Criminal Courts for San Salvador. That's these buildings, and then over there behind us there's the morgue. And that's really the two ways out for an awful lot of gang members. They're either brought here and then go on to jail, or they're brought here dead.
Some prisons were in such a bad state that the guards were not intervening to keep the peace anymore. MS-13 members were just unaliving Barrio 18 members, and the other way around on a daily basis. Then, the government tried keeping separate prisons for each gang. After all, it was mostly gang members who populated these buildings. Other gang members made such a name for themselves that they were recruited by the Sinaloa cartel, Los Zetas, or the CJNG in Mexico. They were so brutal that they attracted the attention of the most violent Mexican cartel kingpins. It was a living nightmare for anyone who didn't want to be a part of these gangs, and women and children throughout the country felt doomed. Death felt imminent, even for the youngest kids. But that all took a sudden change with El Salvador's new president.
But right now, La Campanera feels downright safe, in large part due to a big police presence.
Look how gang-related murders in El Salvador decreased from 2015 to 2022. As of 2024, El Salvador has a murder rate of 2.4 per 100,000 citizens. That's the second lowest murder rate in the Western Hemisphere, below Canada. Yep, El Salvador is safer than the US, and everyone praises President Nayib Bukele for it. Since he took office in 2019, he arrested more than 10% of the country's entire population, some 80,000 people out of a population of 6.3 million.
Human rights groups are dismayed, as are relatives, as more than 65,000 people have been arrested over the past year.
Across the country, more than 70,000 people have already been taken into custody, proudly trumpeting a huge decline in the country's murder rate.
Ya no somos los maras o las maras o los grupos delincuenciales o el país de los muertos, sino que ahora somos El Salvador.
Imagine how people feel after living their whole lives in fear. Now, their children can play outside. It's hard to imagine 80,000 people suddenly arrested in a country of just over 6 million. Nayib Bukele promised a brutal crackdown on gangs ever since he was elected.
Y sí, habrá momentos duros, habrá momentos difíciles, pero tomaremos esas decisiones con valentía. Nos toca ahora a todos tomar un poco de medicina amarga.
He was the first president from a different party, Nuevas Ideas or New Ideas, to take office in a long time. And his last 3 predecessors had all been sent to jail after working side by side with gangs. His party had only one goal: to separate the good from the bad and keep the good safe. In the end, that's what makes a country safe. When there is law enforcement to protect innocent people and arrest the culprits, people feel safe, and the crime rates are low. It sounds so simple, but El Salvador had yet to reach this state of peace and safety. But El Salvador had been controlled by violent, oppressive groups for decades. So this wasn't going to come without a great cost. It was March 24th, 2022, and many El Salvadorans were enjoying another peaceful day outdoors. But this was not going to be a peaceful day. In fact, it became.
El sábado se convirtió en el día más violento de la historia de El Salvador.
Something happened that the government had never experienced before. It was gang retaliation at its worst. MS-13 and Barrio 18 were not happy with Bukele's promise to end gang violence. And you know how the war on darigues or gangs is a two-way street. It often leads to even more violence from the gangs. Between March 24 and 27, 2022, the Salvador gangs unalived 87 people, almost at random.
Querían demostrarle al presidente Nayib Bukele que ellos tenían el control. Nosotros decidimos que ya había llegado, que ya no podíamos seguir más.
Desperate times call for desperate measures. And as the gangs were showing their power, the president decided to up the ante too.
Queda aprobado el proyecto de decreto que contiene régimen de excepción.
64 voted yes. No one voted no. No one abstained. This meant that the government was declaring a state of emergency and surpassing basic human rights laws to put every gang member in prison.
Con ese fin de semana fatídico del 25-26 es que el presidente Nayib Bukele, reunidos con su gabinete de seguridad el 26, se toma la decisión más difícil.
It was supposed to be a 30-day state of emergency, but every single month, it's extended for another month. As of April 2024, it's still happening. Now, the government is no longer obligated to inform someone of the reason for their arrest. Freedom of assembly and privacy of communications have also been suspended.
Y te lo digo yo como jefe de fracción, que estoy seguro que vamos a tener los votos de todos mis compañeros el tiempo que sea necesario y todas las veces que el presidente Nayib Bukele lo solicite.
Now, to arrest tens of thousands of gang members is not exactly easy. First off, you need a massive task force that is no stranger to brutality. Officers have to be prepared for the worst. Gang members will resist arrest, and they have heavy weaponry too. Then, you need the prisons for it. El Salvador prisons were notoriously crowded already. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there was extensive talk about the lack of social distancing. It was hard for people to even breathe or come out of their cells, let alone stay safe from the virus. BBC would write, Latin America has some of the most overcrowded jails in the world. With prisoners crammed into tiny cells by the dozen, social distancing is impossible, and poor medical facilities mean any outbreak of coronavirus would spread like wildfire. As well as one of the largest per capita prison populations, El Salvador has one of the highest per capita murder rates in the world. But that rate has been going down from its height of 17.6 murders per day in 2015 to an average of 3.6 homicides a day in October 2019, and again to 2.1 in March 2020. President Nayib Bukele, who took office in June 2019, claims much of the credit for that drop. His zero-tolerance policy towards gang violence also extends to the country's prisons, with jailed gang members allowed no visitors or phones and confined to their cells 24/7. If, on the other hand, the situation both inside and outside the jails is calm, then normal hours and visitation rights are reinstated. The thing is, when you cram dozens of hateful, violent gang members into tiny cells with nothing to do, violence will only increase. So Bukele came up with another idea.
Tuvimos que construir la cárcel más grande de América Latina.
This is Prison CCOT. It holds 40,000 inmates, and each cell is designed to hold up to 100 prisoners. And if this prison is filled, no worries. Bukele will build another one, and his army will arrest every single gang member in El Salvador. Sound a little brutal? Yeah, some people are criticizing the new government. El Salvador's brutal war on gangs has reached a whole new level. Just like a few years back, everyone lived in fear of getting unalived or losing their loved ones. Today, many people live in fear of getting arrested and not knowing why. However, it's just a handful of people who criticize the president, and most of them are men. It's hard to imagine women and children who haven't felt this safe in generations, trash-talking Bukele. Women are no longer falling victim to SA every day. Children are no longer murdered. And why criticize the government if you don't fear arrest? Like they said, if you're a good citizen, you have nothing to fear. You will be protected. Another expert explained why Bukele's crackdown is not excessive in his view.
Alguna gente dice que eso es un exceso. Yo lo que creo que era exceso era la cantidad de muertos. Para mí era un exceso la cantidad de niñas violadas en El Salvador todos los días. Para mí era un exceso todos los negocios que tenían que pagar extorsión.
But here's the thing. Sometimes, good people are arrested by Bukele's force.
Ella es mi hija, Carla Michelle Mejía, está detenida desde hace 19 meses a causa del régimen. Y es allí donde me toca que luchar para demostrar la inocencia de mi hija.
Carla was accused of being a gang member and thrown in prison. Her father, Alfredo, could not even find out where she was being kept for several months. And when he did find out, he wasn't allowed to visit her. And his several pleas to several institutions were ignored.
Usted va a los juzgados, no pueden dar la información si no va su abogado. Va a la Procuraduría de Derechos Humanos, no es competencia de la Procuraduría dar esa información.
In a sad irony, Bukele's state has become oppressive in its own way. Alfredo doesn't even know if his daughter is still alive. Human rights organizations in El Salvador had reported at least 215 deaths caused by Bukele's crackdown. When the gang members can't be arrested, they're simply unalived and left to their families to bury. Sometimes, inmates just lose their lives inside the prison, and the authorities never report what happened that led to their death. This is not okay. And if the victim wasn't even a part of a gang, it's even more tragic.
No quieren que se sepan qué es lo que pasó. No han sido muertes, han sido asesinatos dentro de las cárceles, o sea, asesinatos del Estado.
Gustavo Villatoro, the Minister of Justice and Public Security, says none of these deaths came at the hands of authorities or officers.
En todas las cárceles alrededor del mundo se mueren prisioneros por temas de enfermedad, por temas de... Hay un sinfín, ¿ya? ¿Qué es lo que tenemos que evitar? Que una o alguna de esa muerte sea por manos de servidores públicos.
But from other people's perspectives, human rights should not be violated, no matter the context.
Ahora, como Crisosal sí hemos recibido hasta 3.600 personas que han sido vulneradas en sus derechos.
In May 2023, El País reported that El Salvador inmates were subjected to unspeakable fates. Others have died after contracting illnesses and not receiving treatment. And it's easy to contract illnesses or infections when you're in a crowded cell of 100 people. It seems like gang members are treated with the same bitter medicine they treated others. But is this the right way? El Salvador is not alone. Gang violence and the war on drugs exists in virtually every country in Latin America. But right now, Nayib Bukele has a 92% approval rate. That's huge compared to most presidents who have rates below 50%. For now, most of the country's population agrees with his methods, however brutal they are. Other governments are slowly taking note and copying his regime.
Muchos países de Latinoamérica están pasando por este tipo de situaciones.
Ecuador liked Prison CCOT so much, they built one just like it. The country's president, Daniel Noboa, explained simply.
Para todos los Bukele lovers, es una cárcel igualita.
This is big news for the entire region. Now, people are seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. Perhaps there is hope to end cartel violence all over America.
Creo que ya está generando mucha esperanza. Cualquier estado tiene capacidad de derrotar al crimen organizado, que es el principal enemigo de millones de latinoamericanos.
But does a crackdown on gangs ask for unspeakable violence? Or can it be done another way? And if El Salvador ends its state of emergency, will the gangs fight back? Hey, thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on the El Salvador war on gangs? Do you know other similar stories? Let me know in the comments section. And before you leave, you know the drill. Like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. See you next time.